dark or too light? Are you too tall or too short? Too cynical or too naive? Too athletic or too sedentary? It seems to me that many of us, at least, I can't say all, but it's certainly been my experience that many of us are continually struggling in some way to prove our worthiness. Are you worthy? Do you know it? From the days that we begin talking to the child about Santa Claus, who brings a trove of wonders to the child who is good enough, we have to be enough. And we have to prove it. I remember the standardized testing that began in elementary school and continued year after year, graded not numerically, but on a percentile. What matters is how many people you exceeded. And nothing but 99th percentile was sufficient. I remember the first time I heard that song that we sang as our opening hymn. I was 50 years old. And it knocked me down. I was sitting in the front row of a worship service and hearing these words I had never heard before in my life. How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? Now don't get me wrong, I have been loved my whole life. I grew up in a very comfortable home. There was no abuse or hostility. I was not bullied as a child. Many people, as I grew, have had difficulty dealing with me or what they perceive when they encounter me, but by and large, I have not faced a violent response in my life. But I always knew I was different. I always knew that I was not quite right. Just not quite right. When I was in the age of magical thinking, I thought that I was not actually human, that I had somehow been planted in my family, who received me fairly well, but surely they knew I wasn't one of them. Throughout my life, people have received me with love and acceptance, but I have always received it as, I love you anyway. I love you anyway. Nobody else said it. But also nobody ever said, how could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? I was raised in a religion that held to the doctrine of original sin. You may know it. It is the idea that humanity is tainted by the fall in the Garden of Eden. That the very first act of disobedience in the ancient mythology of early humankind represents the inherent depravity of human beings. That we are born inevitably and inextricably, inherently corrupt. And our only hope is salvation through the intervention of God. That's it. That's the only hope. Without that, we are destined to suffer the consequences of the inherent depravity of humanity. That is a dominant belief in Christian thought. It's not universal, and it's becoming less prevalent. However, it's still pretty pervasive. And among the early thinkers in our movement, it is entirely rejected as invalid, illogical, and unscriptural. The same source, the Genesis story, tells us that we are created in the image of this God. That is the mythology upon which our tradition places its faith in creed. We are created in the image of the divine. We are, yes, inevitably drawn to the source of knowledge that the second chapter of Genesis tells us about. And maybe against our better judgment, maybe against the best advice, we pursue it, sometimes to our detriment. But we are created, according to that story, in the very image of our Creator. Now, to me, it does not matter that I do not hold to the thought of a creator being having established humanity on this earth. The form that that creation takes that is depicted in this beautiful myth is evolution. It works pretty darn well. But the notion that we are somehow, as human beings, born inherently corrupt is simply not supported by reason or by Scripture. If you follow the arc of the Hebrew Scripture and of Jesus, it is unmistakable that Jesus, as he called his disciples back to the core of the Judaism he held dear, sat with those that society judged unworthy, unwelcome, less than whole. He welcomed, he sat with, he dined with, the most intimate act of fellowship in the Hebrew tradition. He ate with them. There is, at some point in the writings of Paul, the appearance of this intense self-loathing. He says that I would not do, I can't help myself. And what I would do, I fail. Now, scholars have suggested that Paul might have been gay. And as you read some of his self-disclosure in that light, some of it really starts to make sense. This is a man who, for whatever reason, whether it be sexuality, addiction, some yearning within him was irresistible. And he struggled with it despite his devotion. But through his own self-loathing, he came to see humanity as inherently flawed and broken. And so the death and resurrection of Jesus is a symbolic representation of something come to rescue us from our depravity. Now, in Paul's day, the movement that was built around the teachings of Jesus was a minority underground movement. But within a few centuries, it became a political and even military force. And how useful it is. If you want to control a body of people, ethnically diverse, economically diverse, people scattered, if you can convince them that they are born back, and their only hope for eternal life is to sign on to what you got. It's really no surprise that this idea takes hold in Christianity, which is a mechanism of political control throughout the Middle Ages and well into the Enlightenment era. It's really important that those in power convince those without power, who vastly outnumber them, who are brutally oppressed. They gotta believe they're not worthy. Because if you can't convince those people that they're not worthy, they're gonna take what they deserve. And so we are the heirs of a religion that was crafted carefully to engineer political and social oppression. When our ancestors arrived on this continent, it was with an intent to push back against the mechanisms of oppression that had been created through the papacy and through the Church of England, and yet there was the old habit of religion based on theology. And so, because it's what we know how to do, the Puritans came here and constructed a pretty effective mechanism of oppression. And we continue to work our way through. We Unitarians and Universalists pride ourselves on being in the forefront of social thinking. Yes, many of us were anti-slavery activists. Many were not. Many of us worked actively against U.S. invasion of nations for economic or political control. Many did not. We were, the Unitarians were the first tradition to ordain women. We were the first tradition to ordain openly gay ministers. We were the first tradition to ordain transgender ministers. But that's only been a couple decades. When I started as a Unitarian Universalist, the idea of welcoming congregation, the idea that we are on an equal footing, sexual minority people and heterosexual people, that was still pretty hard to talk about. So Unitarian Universalists are insistent on the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but we continue to struggle in living into that. And we are, after all, human. Now, I don't say that it's a consequence of a lifetime of competition, but I can't help but notice that from school to internships to early jobs to management positions, our entire life is built around getting ahead of somebody else. When I was in high school, I was a junior in high school, I quit playing games. I had enough. I quit Dungeons and Dragons. In the days before there was a personal computer, and most people had never heard of it. It was one of those things that only us weird kids did. But we did it for hours and hours every week. And I just started to notice how the spirit of competition was creeping into our relationships. And I felt it warping my personality. Always trying to get ahead, to outscore, outrun, outperform, out-earn, out-whatever. To prove my worth because I could not really believe it. I knew it. I mean, we all know it pretty well. But, man, I didn't feel it. Are you worthy? Do you know it? We, as Unitarian Universalists, continually affirm the inherent worth and dignity of every person. But as I mentioned this week, these principles are not observation of fact. They are collective commitment to ideal. It is necessary, if we as a nation are to wage war against another nation, to devalue the humanity of others. You can't do it otherwise. One cannot drop bombs on one's own brothers and sisters. So the only way to get there is to somehow reduce, if not entirely erase, the worthiness of other people. I am not offering an opinion as to whether any particular military action is just or unjust. That is too complex a question, and I get both sides of it. But let's be honest about what it takes in order to engage in this. It is the same thing that it takes in order for a corrections officer to work in a place where he has authority over 50 or 60 inmates. If he makes the mistake of seeing these as human beings, he's not going to be able to do his job. But as we do this, as we begin just in order to function effectively in society, we know that we are devaluing the others. We know it. And we carry that shame too. As I reflected on talking about worth this morning, during the week it struck me, that's right. If I say Black Lives Matter, you think maybe I'm saying yours matters less. Of course that's not what I'm saying. If I say I care about Zandy's well-being, it is not devaluing Nick's. I mean, rationally, we're rational thinkers. We understand that asserting appreciation and reverence for one thing in no way diminishes our reverence and appreciation for another. We know that. And yet, for many people in this country, when we hear words that assert the worthiness of people who have been long oppressed and victimized, we somehow feel as though it is an assault on our own worthiness. We haven't lost the capacity to reason. We are just being touched with our own shame at the way that we move through life, necessarily valuing ourselves above others, necessarily valuing those like us above those unlike us in order to secure our physical safety. It's how the world works. We know better. But it is how the world works. So in order to appreciate the full worthiness of one another, we need to admit to ourselves how it feels to see our own sense of unworthiness. To admit, yes, I carry shame, deserved or not. It does me no good. It serves no effective purpose. If I would hope for the equality, ultimately, of every human being on this planet, the last thing I need is shame, because shame immobilizes and paralyzes. And that's not doing anybody any. So when we say the lives of Black people, of immigrant people, of gay people, of transgender, of children, of elderly, of disabled, of whatever people. When we say that those lives matter, we must recognize the sense of unease, and unworthiness that lies beneath our conscience. And that when we say, well, I never owned slaves, I never beat somebody up in a dark alley, it's not my fault, that is not actually an assertion of innocence, but rather a manifestation of our collective shame. We have to own that. We have to uncover that. Because shame immobilizes and paralyzes us. We live in a city that cannot talk about race. What the hell? This is Montgomery, Alabama. And it's easier to have a conversation about race almost anywhere else in the country than it is in Montgomery. We have to uncover that shame. Or we remain stuck. A place of spiritual immobility, a place that is it's a source of humor for the late night talk shows, and not much more. So, are you worthy? You know you are. But can you own it? Can you be the one to say, in the mirror, how could anyone ever tell you were less than all? Join me now, if you will, in